Most people don't notice the moment their life changes, because it usually looks like nothing at all. Ethan Cole had perfected the art of being ignored, which was a useful skill in a place like Nexus Gate Station, where importance was measured in uniforms, titles, and how many people stopped talking when you walked in. He had none of those things, just a worn civilian jacket, a tray with food that cost more than it should, and a quiet habit of choosing seats no one else wanted, like the one near the panoramic glass where freighters drifted past, like slow-moving cities, and no one bothered to sit. Because it was too exposed, too ordinary, too close to someone like him. The station itself hummed with layered systems, gravity calibrated just slightly off to remind you it wasn't natural, lights adjusting brightness as if judging productivity, and somewhere overhead an announcement chimed about docking clearances that no one listened to unless it mattered to them, which it didn't for Ethan. He sat, ate, and watched the reflection of people who never looked back, officers in polished uniforms, diplomats with measured voices, merchants pretending they weren't calculating profit margins in real time, all of them orbiting invisible hierarchies he had long ago learned not to step into. A pair of officers approached the empty seats nearby, paused when they saw him, and chose to stand instead, which was new but not surprising, and Ethan decided that if being avoided came with extra personal space, he could live with that. He took a sip of something that claimed to be coffee and tasted like a negotiation between chemicals and regret, and told himself that this assignment would be quick, quiet, and forgettable, just the way he preferred. Then the doors opened, and the station did something subtle, something almost polite, like holding its breath without admitting it was doing so. Ethan didn't look up immediately, because people like him learned early that reacting too fast to important things only made them more noticeable. But he felt it anyway, the shift in posture around him. Conversations thinning, the faint recalibration of attention that spread through the room like a ripple no one wanted to acknowledge. Boots touched the floor with controlled precision, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, and the kind of certainty that made other people adjust themselves without realizing why. Ethan finally glanced up, just enough to confirm what the room already knew, and saw her, Commander Lyra Vale, moving through the space with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything because everything had already been decided in her favor. She looked almost human at first glance, which was the most deceptive kind of difference. Her features composed, her posture exact, her long, elegantly tapered ears angled slightly forward as if listening to something no one else could hear, and people made space for her without being asked, a natural law rearranging itself around a stronger gravity. Ethan looked back at his tray, because that was the safest response, and because whatever happened next would not involve him. It never did. Except this time, the footsteps didn't pass, they slowed, then stopped, and the absence of movement was louder than any announcement the station could make. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole had the distinct and inconvenient feeling that being invisible had just stopped working. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured in small, careful ways, a chair shifting half an inch, a breath taken too quietly to be admitted, the faint hum of the station recalibrating as if it needed to confirm reality had not glitched. Ethan kept his eyes on his tray for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary, then looked up because ignoring something this deliberate would have been suspicious even for him. And there she was, close enough. Now that the details refused to stay abstract, the subtle lines of her uniform woven with circuitry that caught the light like restrained lightning, the stillness in her posture that was not stiffness but control, the kind built over years of being watched and never giving anything away unless it was intentional. Commander Lyra Vale did not speak immediately, and that was somehow worse, because the absence of words stretched the moment thin and precise, like something being measured. Ethan glanced around once, just enough to confirm what he already knew. No one was pretending anymore. They were watching openly now, not moving, not interfering, just observing with the kind of attention reserved for events that would later be described in quieter voices. He set his cup down carefully, because hands that moved too fast attracted questions, and questions were expensive. "You are in the wrong section," he said finally. Tone even, conversational, the way you might inform someone they had taken a seat reserved for someone else, because framing reality as normal was sometimes the only way to survive it. Her eyes did not leave his. and there was something in them that did not match the room, not the authority everyone else reacted to, but something sharper, more focused, like recognition that had not yet decided what it meant. "Am I?" she replied, voice low, precise, unhurried, the translation field barely adjusting around her words as if it understood that accuracy mattered more here than speed. Ethan considered that, then shrugged slightly, a small movement, controlled. "Statistically speaking, yes, but I have been wrong before," which was not entirely a joke and not entirely not one. One of the officers near the far table shifted his weight, then stopped halfway through the motion as if completing it might have consequences. Lyra's gaze flicked briefly to Ethan's hands, the faint calluses, the small grease mark near his wrist that had resisted cleaning, then back to his face, and something in her posture adjusted by a fraction, not softer, not yet, but less distant. "You are not assigned here," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact she had already verified. "Neither is my coffee," Ethan replied, glancing at the cup, "but we are both making the best of it." And for a fraction of a second, the corner of her mouth moved, not enough to be called a smile, but enough to disrupt the perfect control everyone expected. The room reacted to that almost imperceptibly, a tightening of attention, a recalculation. She leaned back slightly, not retreating, just creating space that somehow felt more intentional than proximity. "What is your function, Ethan Cole?" she asked, and the way she said his name landed differently. Not like she had read it, but like she had been confirming it. Ethan blinked once, slow, because that was new. "At the moment, I am trying to finish lunch without becoming a topic of discussion," he said, then added after a beat. "Historically, that has been an achievable goal." And this time the shift in her expression was clearer, still restrained, but undeniably there, around them. The station seemed to hold the moment in place, as if waiting for a decision it did not have the authority to make. Lyra's ears angled forward slightly. The movement subtle but precise, a signal Ethan did not fully understand but instinctively recognized as attention sharpened to a point. "That may no longer be possible," she said quietly, and then, just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "You will remain where you are," and across the room. Several people who outranked Ethan in every measurable way suddenly found themselves unsure whether they were allowed to move at all. No one moved, not because they were told not to, but because the meaning of that instruction was still unfolding in real time, and no one wanted to be the first to misunderstand it. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, just enough to feel the edge of the moment without stepping outside it, because there was a difference between being included and being positioned. And right now he was not entirely sure which one he was. "That sounds less like a suggestion," he said quietly, keeping his tone level, almost thoughtful, as if they were discussing seating etiquette instead of whatever this had become. Commander Lyra Vale did not look away, and up close there was something precise about the way she observed him, not scanning, not evaluating in the usual sense, but aligning, as if she were comparing him to something that existed elsewhere. "It is not a suggestion," she replied, her voice steady, and the translation field carried it cleanly across the immediate tables, far enough that several conversations died completely. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a small, controlled breath. "That complicates my schedule," he said, glancing briefly at the station clock projected along the glass, which displayed time in 3 different systems, as if uncertainty required redundancy. A faint sound escaped her, not quite laughter, but closer than anything else the room had heard from her since she entered, and it changed the atmosphere in a way no announcement ever could. Across the room, an aide shifted, then froze again when one of the security officers subtly shook his head, a silent reminder that whatever protocol applied here was no longer standard. Lyra's attention returned fully to Ethan, her ears angled forward again, more distinctly now. "Your schedule has already been adjusted," she said, and there was something in the phrasing that suggested this had been decided before she walked through the door. Ethan tilted his head slightly, the motion small but deliberate. "That seems inefficient," he replied. "Most people prefer to consult me before reorganizing my day," which earned him a look from a nearby officer that hovered somewhere between disbelief and professional concern. Lyra did not react to the comment in any visible way, but her gaze sharpened. "Most people are not relevant," she said simply, and the sentence landed with a weight that did not need emphasis. Ethan considered that for a second, then nodded once. That is a strong position to take before lunch, he said, because humor was still the only tool that felt stable, and because backing down would have implied he understood more than he did. Her eyes flicked briefly to the tray in front of him, then back to his face, and for the first time there was a hint of something else beneath the control, not softness, not yet, but recognition beginning to settle into place. You have been here for 43 minutes, she said, and it was not a guess. Ethan blinked once, slower this time. That is impressively specific, he replied. I lost track around minute 20. And somewhere behind him, a data slate slipped from someone's hand and clattered softly against the floor, the sound startling in a room that had grown too careful. Lyra did not acknowledge the interruption. You chose this seat immediately, she continued, despite multiple alternatives with higher visibility and lower exposure to traffic flow. And now the observation was unmistakable. She had been watching him before. This moment. Ethan leaned back a fraction more, studying her properly now. You make it sound like a tactical decision, he said. It was the only place no one else wanted. And that, more than anything else, seemed to settle something in her expression. Her posture shifted, barely, but enough that the distance between them felt different, less like inspection and more like confirmation. Exactly, she said quietly. And then after a brief pause that stretched just long enough to matter, that is why you are still alive in places where others are not. And the sentence did not carry threat or drama, just certainty, which somehow made it heavier. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there were moments when speaking too quickly closed doors you did not yet see, and instead he held her gaze, steady, grounded, the way he always did when something larger than expected began to take shape around them. The station resumed motion in careful increments, but the space surrounding their table remained untouched, like a boundary no one had been given permission to cross. And for the first time since he sat down, Ethan understood that whatever this was, it had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with being seen by the one person in the room who never looked without a reason. The words settled between them without raising their voice, and that made them harder to ignore. Ethan did not flinch, but something in his posture shifted, not defensive, not aggressive, just attentive in a way that suggested he had decided this moment was worth understanding. That is a very specific assumption, he said after a second, tone even, almost curious, as if they were discussing probabilities instead of survival, and the calmness of it drew a few more glances from across the room. The kind of glances people tried to hide but no longer bothered to. Commander Lyra. Vale watched him the way one studied a pattern that refused to behave like the others, her eyes steady, her expression controlled, but no longer distant in the way it had been when she first entered. There was something more focused now, like a variable had finally aligned. It is not an assumption, she replied, and the certainty in her voice did not feel like authority, it felt like memory. Ethan rested his forearms lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself in something ordinary, because ordinary things were easier to control. Then you have information I do not, he said, and the statement carried no challenge, just fact. A faint shift moved through the nearby officers, subtle but noticeable, as if the conversation had crossed into territory that was no longer meant for public interpretation, yet no one dared interrupt. Lyra's gaze flicked briefly past him, not toward the room, but toward the glass behind him, where the reflection of the station overlaid the distant stars, then returned, sharper now. You were in Sector 12 3 months ago, she said, and this time the sentence landed differently, not as observation, but as placement. Ethan's eyes narrowed by a fraction, not enough to be obvious, but enough to register the change. That depends on who is asking, he replied, because answers always depended on context, and context was rarely offered freely. A faint pause followed, not empty, but deliberate, and in that pause the room seemed to lean closer without moving. Lyra did not blink. I am, she said simply. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that bought time without looking like it needed to. Then yes, he said. I was passing through, which was technically true and therefore the safest version of the truth. Her ears angled forward again, more distinctly this time, and the movement drew a quiet ripple of attention from those who understood what it meant, which was not many, but enough. You rerouted an evacuation corridor that was predicted to fail, she continued, her tone unchanged, but the content of her words pulling the air tighter around them. The official report lists it as an anomaly. Ethan's gaze drifted briefly to the glass, watching a cargo vessel align with a docking arm with mechanical precision. Official reports are often optimistic, he said, because understatement had always been his preferred form of accuracy. A faint sound escaped her again, closer to recognition now than anything else. You diverted resources without authorization, she said, and there was no accusation in it. Only confirmation. Ethan shrugged slightly, a small, unbothered motion. Authorization was delayed, he replied. The situation was not. And somewhere behind them, someone exhaled too sharply and immediately regretted it. Lyra held his gaze, and for the first time the edge of something softer appeared, not weakness, not sentiment, but approval that had not yet been declared. 17 successful extractions, she said quietly, and the number landed heavier than anything else she had said so far, because numbers did not exaggerate. 0 losses. Ethan looked back at her fully now, no longer pretending this was casual, but still refusing to make it dramatic. You have been reading the wrong files, he said, because deflection was instinct, and because being defined by numbers was rarely accurate. She shook her head once, precise, minimal. I have been reading the only files that matter, she replied, and then after a brief pause that shifted the weight of the moment again, and they all point to you. And across the room, the realization spread not as noise, but as silence, the kind that followed when something ordinary was revealed to be anything, but the silence did not fade this time. It settled deeper. Like the station itself had decided this moment required accuracy, not noise. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then looked down at his hands, as if confirming they were still the same hands that had picked this seat, because no one else wanted it. Because the idea that someone like her had been tracing his movements across systems did not fit neatly into the version of reality he preferred. That seems unlikely, he said finally, tone calm, almost dismissive, the kind of calm that came from years of being overlooked. I am very good at not being pointed to. And the statement would have passed as self-deprecating anywhere else, but here it landed differently, because she did not disagree. Commander Lyra Vale leaned forward slightly, not closing the distance, just changing the angle, and the subtle shift drew every eye that dared to watch, because it meant something had progressed beyond observation. That is exactly why, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no need to justify. The logic, patterns that avoid attention are still patterns. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something between a sigh and a reluctant acknowledgement, because that was not wrong, and wrong would have been easier to dismiss. He reached for his cup again, more for the motion than the drink, grounding himself in something predictable. You are assigning meaning to coincidence, he said, because that was the safest explanation, the one that required the least adjustment to everything else. Lyra's eyes did not leave his. There are no coincidences in 17 separate incidents across 6 systems, she replied, and now the numbers were not just data. They were structure, something built deliberately over time. A low murmur attempted to form at the far end of the room and failed halfway through, suppressed by the collective understanding that this conversation was not meant to be interrupted. Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering her words as if they were a puzzle rather than an accusation. You are overestimating my level of importance, he said, because humility had always been easier than explanation, and because importance attracted attention, and attention complicated everything. Lyra studied him for a long moment, and this time there was no distance left in it, only focus, precise and unwavering. No, she said quietly, I am correcting it. And the sentence carried a weight that did not need to be raised to be heard. Something shifted then, not in the room, but in him, a small internal recalibration, the recognition that this was no longer a misunderstanding that could be resolved with casual deflection. He set the cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision there might compensate for the lack of it everywhere else. And what exactly does that correction lead to? He asked, because questions were safer than answers. Lyra did not respond immediately, and the pause that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, measured, the kind of pause that allowed everyone within hearing range to understand that whatever came next mattered. Her ears angled forward again, fully this time, no longer subtle, and for those who understood the gesture, it meant attention had become intent. "It leads to a decision," she said, and the words settled into the space between them with quiet authority. Ethan's expression did not change, but there was a flicker of something. Behind it now, curiosity sharpened by caution. "About me," he said, not a question, just a confirmation. Lyra nodded once. "Precise. About you," she repeated, and then, just loud enough that the nearest tables could not pretend they had misheard, she added, "You will be reassigned," and across the room, the reaction did not come as sound, but as stillness, the kind that followed when something irreversible had just been set into motion, and for the first time since he sat down, Ethan understood that the seat he had chosen to be invisible had just become the center of something he could no longer step away from. The word reassigned did not echo. It settled, precise and final, like a coordinate locked into a navigation system that did not accept revisions. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then leaned back slightly, as if distance might make the statement easier to evaluate. "That seems premature," he said, tone steady, not defiant, not compliant, just grounded in the kind of logic that preferred process over sudden decisions. Most reassignments involve paperwork, notifications, at least a mildly confused supervisor. And somewhere to his left, a junior officer almost made a sound before stopping himself mid-breath. Commander Lyra Vale did not shift, but the stillness around her felt more intentional now, less like presence and more like control applied with precision. "Those steps have already been completed," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than a longer explanation would have. Ethan blinked once, slower this time, because that implied a timeline that had begun before he sat down, before he even knew this conversation existed. "That is efficient," he said after a second, because understatement was still the only safe response. Slightly concerning, but efficient. And for the briefest moment, something in her expression softened again, not enough to be called warmth, but enough to suggest that his reaction had matched an expectation. Across the room, a data console flickered as someone attempted to pull up information they were no longer authorized to see, and the screen dimmed politely, as if declining to participate. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on Ethan. "Your current assignment has been classified as provisional," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, each word placed carefully. "It no longer applies." Ethan rested his hands on the table. Again, fingers loosely interlocked, the posture calm but not passive. "That is unfortunate," he replied. "I was just beginning to understand where the exits were," which drew a faint shift of attention from a nearby guard who clearly did not appreciate the humor but could not object to it either. Lyra's ears angled forward once more, the movement sharper now, unmistakable. "You will not need the exits," she said, and the certainty in her voice did not feel like reassurance, it felt like inevitability. Ethan studied her for a moment, really studied her now, the precision in her posture, the controlled way she occupied space, the way the room aligned itself around her without being told, and for the first time he allowed himself to consider the possibility that this was not a misunderstanding he could outlast, but a decision he had already been included in. "And what exactly will I need?" he asked, because if the situation was no longer avoidable, understanding it became the next best option. Lyra did not answer immediately, and the pause that followed carried a different weight than before, less about observation, more about selection, as if the words she chose would define something beyond the moment. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, but no less precise. "You will need to do what you have already been doing," she said. "Except this time, you will not be doing it alone." And the sentence shifted the air around them in a way that drew a sharper reaction than anything else she had said so far. Ethan's expression remained steady, but something behind it tightened slightly. Not fear, not resistance, just the recognition that this was expanding beyond him. "That is a very broad job description," he said, because clarity was still preferable to implication, and because broad descriptions tended to hide complicated expectations. Lyra inclined her head a fraction, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. It will be clarified, she said. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to pull the attention of the entire room toward her, she added, in a more appropriate setting. And at that moment, two uniformed figures approached from the edge of the space, stopping at a respectful distance, not interrupting, just waiting. Their presence a quiet confirmation that whatever had just been decided was already moving forward. Ethan glanced at them briefly, then back to her. I assume. Those are not here for the coffee, he said. And this time the faintest trace of amusement reached her eyes, quick and controlled. No, she replied. They are here for you. And across the room, the realization spread not as shock, but as silence deepening into something more permanent, because the man no one had noticed 10 minutes ago was now the only variable that mattered. The two figures did not step closer immediately, and that restraint made their presence more deliberate, not guards advancing, but confirmations waiting for permission to become action. Ethan watched them for a second, then returned his attention to Lyra, because they were not the decision. She was. That feels excessive for a lunch interruption, he said calmly, resting back into his chair as if this were still something that could be categorized as mildly inconvenient rather than structurally significant. And a faint ripple of disbelief moved through the nearby tables, quickly suppressed. Commander Lyra. Vale did not look at the approaching officers, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about their relevance in this hierarchy. It is not excessive, she replied, her tone unchanged, precise as ever. It is appropriate. And the words settled with quiet finality. Ethan considered that, then nodded once, as if filing it away rather than resisting it. That depends on perspective, he said, because perspective was often the only variable left when control was removed, and because conceding too quickly created expectations he had no intention of meeting. Lyra studied him again, more closely now, not searching for inconsistencies, but confirming stability. And there was a subtle shift in her posture, not forward, not back, but aligned, as if the decision had moved from theoretical to active. Your perspective has already been accounted for, she said, and there was something in the phrasing that suggested this was not the first time she had considered his response. Ethan let out a quiet breath, then glanced briefly at the two figures again, noting their stillness, the way they held position without drawing attention, trained to wait, not to act. They are very patient, he observed, tone light, almost conversational. I appreciate that in people who may be about to complicate my day. And one of the officers near the far side of the room visibly stiffened before catching himself. Lyra's expression shifted by a fraction, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. They are not here to complicate anything, she said. They are here to ensure continuity. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. That is a reassuring way to describe being escorted, he replied, and the word hung there, testing the boundaries of the situation without breaking them. For the first time, Lyra's gaze flicked briefly to the figures behind him, then back. A silent signal passed without movement, and the two adjusted their stance by a fraction, confirming receipt. You are not being escorted, she said, and the correction was immediate, deliberate. You are being received. And across the room, the distinction landed with more weight than the words themselves, because reception implied intention, not containment. Ethan paused at that, the difference settling into place whether he liked it or not. That is a stronger word, he said quietly. People tend to notice when it is used. And as if on cue, several individuals who had been pretending not to listen suddenly found something very interesting about their tables. Lyra inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without altering the outcome. They are meant to notice, she said. And that was the moment the entire situation shifted from private anomaly to public declaration. Ethan looked at her for a long second, measuring not just her words, but the intent behind them. And for the first time since this began, he allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch the corner of his mouth, not because the situation was amusing, but because it had become clear. You could have done this quietly, he said, and it was not a question. Lyra met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, she replied, and then, after a brief pause that drew every remaining thread of attention toward her, she added, but that would have defeated the purpose, and the meaning of that settled through the room like gravity resetting itself. Because this was no longer about moving him, it was about everyone seeing that he had been chosen. The realization did not arrive loudly. It settled into the room the way gravity did, constant and unavoidable, and once it was there, everything else adjusted around it. Ethan let that sit for a moment, then reached for his tray with a kind of deliberate normalcy that felt almost out of place now, finishing the last bite as if completing a task he had started before any of this mattered, because leaving things unfinished had always been a habit he avoided. The two figures behind him shifted again, not forward, just enough to signal readiness, and the restraint in that movement spoke more clearly than any command could have. "You are very committed to the demonstration," he said, glancing back at Lyra, his tone still level, still controlled, but now carrying a thin edge of awareness that had not been there before. Commander Lyra Vale did not deny it, did not soften it. She simply held his gaze with the same steady focus. "Clarity requires visibility," she replied, and the sentence moved through the surrounding tables like a quiet confirmation of what they were already beginning to understand. Ethan nodded once, slow, thoughtful. "And what exactly are we clarifying?" he asked, because if this was meant to be seen, then it had a purpose beyond him, and purpose was something he needed to understand before stepping into it. Lyra leaned back slightly this time, the motion controlled, but different from before, less about closing distance and more about allowing the moment to widen. "That you are no longer operating independently," she said, and there was no ambiguity in it, no room for interpretation, just a statement that redefined the boundaries of his position. Across the room, someone quietly set down a glass that they had been holding for far too long, the sound small but impossibly loud in the stillness. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a faint, almost amused breath. "That is one way to describe it," he said, then added after a brief pause. "Another would be that I have lost my ability to disappear." And this time, the reaction was immediate, subtle shifts in posture, a tightening of attention, because the sentence carried more truth than most of them were comfortable acknowledging. Lyra's eyes did not waver, but there was something different in them now, not just recognition, but something closer to approval, as if he had finally said something that aligned perfectly with her understanding. "You were never meant to disappear," she said quietly, and the certainty in her voice was not based on belief, but on conclusion. Ethan studied her for a moment, really studied her now, not as a commander, not as a presence that reshaped rooms, but as the one person who had looked at everything he had worked to erase and decided it mattered. "That seems like an inconvenient design flaw," he replied, because humor was still the only way to keep the ground from shifting too quickly beneath him. For the briefest moment, the corner of her mouth moved again, restrained, controlled, but real enough that those close enough to see it would remember it later. "It is not a flaw," she said. "It is a correction," and the repetition of the word anchored it more firmly into place. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table once more, no longer pretending this was temporary, no longer framing it as something that would pass if he waited long enough. "And if I decline the correction?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a necessary variable in the equation. The room tightened again, not visibly, but perceptibly, as if even the air wanted to hear the answer. Lyra did not hesitate. "You will not," she said, and there was no force in it, no threat, just the same quiet certainty that had carried every word she had spoken so far. Ethan held her gaze for a long second, then leaned back again, the motion slow, controlled, acceptance not stated, but no longer resisted. "That is a very confident prediction," he said, and this time there was no humor in it, just acknowledgement. Lyra inclined her head slightly, precise as ever. "It is not a prediction," she replied. And then, after a pause that seemed to draw the entire room into alignment with her words, she added, "It is recognition." And with that, she stood, the movement smooth, unhurried, but final, and the two figures behind Ethan stepped forward in perfect synchronization, not to take him, not to force him, but to stand ready beside him, as if the choice had already been made, and all that remained was for him to follow where it was leading. The moment she stood, the room did not react with movement. It reacted with alignment, as if every person present had just recalibrated their understanding of where importance truly sat. Ethan remained seated for exactly 1 second longer than expected, not out of defiance, but out of habit, the quiet instinct to finish observing before stepping into something irreversible. Then he pushed his chair back slowly, the sound soft against the floor, controlled, deliberate, and in the silence that followed, it carried farther than it should have. The two figures at his side adjusted with him, not guiding, not touching, just matching his movement as if they had already synchronized to it. Ethan straightened, rolling his shoulders once as if preparing for something routine rather than something that had just shifted the perception of an entire room, and glanced briefly at his tray, at the half-finished drink, the ordinary details that no longer fit the situation. "I was going to finish that," he said quietly, almost to himself, and one of the nearby officers blinked as if unsure whether that counted as humor or something else entirely. Commander Lyra Vale watched him rise, her posture unchanged, her presence still anchoring the space. But there was something different now, something settled, as if a variable she had been tracking for a long time had finally resolved. "It will still be here," she said, and the sentence carried a meaning that extended far beyond the table, beyond the meal, beyond the moment itself. Ethan looked at her. Really looked this time, not as someone caught in a situation, but as someone recognizing the shape of it. "That is optimistic," he replied, because optimism was easier to accept than inevitability, even when both pointed in the same direction. A faint shift moved through the room as he took his first step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just measured, and the two figures beside him moved in perfect coordination, creating a formation that was not restrictive, but unmistakably defined. Conversations did not resume. They remained suspended, held in place by the understanding that whatever this was, it was not finished yet. As Ethan reached her, Lyra turned slightly, not away from him, but with him, aligning their direction as if the next part of this had always been intended to be shared. For a moment, they stood side by side, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. Her presence shaped by authority, precision, and recognition. His shaped by quiet restraint, understated control, and something that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Then she spoke again, not loudly, but with just enough clarity to reach the edges of the room. "He moves with us." And the words did not command, they confirmed. The effect was immediate, not in sound, but in stillness deepening into something more permanent, because everyone present understood what that meant, not just in the moment, but in everything that would follow. Ethan exhaled slowly, not resisting, not surrendering, simply accepting the direction of something he had not chosen but could no longer avoid. "You realize," he said quietly as they began to walk, "this is going to make me very difficult to ignore." And there was no complaint in it, just observation. Lyra glanced at him briefly, and this time the softness in her expression was not imagined, not fleeting, it was controlled, but present. "That was never an option," she replied, and together they moved toward the exit, the station parting around them in silent acknowledgement, while behind them, the space they left behind did not return to normal, because everyone who had witnessed it understood that something had just been publicly rewritten, and far beyond the doors that were already opening ahead. Whatever waited for Ethan Cole next was not a reassignment. It was the beginning of something that had been waiting for him long before he ever chose that empty seat.